The odds are is that you have a number of AWS accounts. You may just have one. And even if you just have one, I would suggest you look at AWS Organizations. AWS Organizations is an account management service. It allows you to manage security controls and link the security controls across multiple AWS accounts in a tree-like structure. Once your accounts are organized in the tree for AWS Organizations, you can look at organizing your accounts into desired organizational unit structures, similar to what we see with Active Directory. The features of AWS Organizations include that the organizational permissions overrule individual AWS account permissions, so you get centralized control. Ultimately, the grouping of multiple AWS accounts that's organized as an organization integrate centrally with identity and access management control. Once your tree-like structure for AWS Organizations is set up, users can access only what's allowed by both the organizational policies, which match up against the organizational unit where their account resides, and IAM policies. So we have some interesting elements for control. When we set up AWS Organizations and create our first organization, we have to decide who's going to do the paying. We can track costs with AWS Organization using consolidated billing features. Once I've created my initial tree and added in my first account, which becomes the master account, then I can invite additional AWS accounts into my tree. Then I can apply policy-based controls to members of my tree. Using AWS Organizations allows you to manage organization-wide management of specific AWS services, and the list of services that supports organizations is growing all the time. The master account, the first account that you add to AWS Organizations, is assigned the responsibility of paying the bills. It pays for all the charges that are accrued by the member accounts of the organization. So if you have a single AWS account, I think it makes perfect sense to add that account to AWS Organizations. You're paying all your bills, and as additional accounts come into your organization, you can decide where they fit in the tree. What sorts of control policies do you want to apply? So once we set up our root account in the AWS organization, it's the parent account for all accounts in your org. And then we get to decide where our accounts are going to be placed in the OUs. Then we can define our policy flow. Is the policy affecting a single account, or is the policy affecting an OU which has many consolidated accounts? Obviously, you'll have to do some whiteboarding to see how your accounts match up, how you want to do your overall control. Another big feature of AWS Organizations is called a Service Control Policy, or SCP. If I apply it to a root account, it affects everybody in the tree. If I apply it to a specific OU, then it will affect the accounts in that OU and all the sub-accounts. I can also use a security control policy for an individual AWS account, even an AWS account outside of organizations. Think of the service control policies as a filter that defines the services and the actions that the users and the roles can use where the SCP is applied. An SCP acts like an allow and deny filter. So the defined services and actions that are defined in your SCP list, only those services are going to be allowed or denied. Now note the SCPs affect only the principals that are managed by the AWS accounts that are part of the AWS organization. But you can also define, under Identity and Access Management, service control policies for an individual user account within a single AWS account. As you may expect, the SCPs are working with identity and access management, and they filter the permissions available to the AWS accounts that are in scope. The access is either explicitly allowed, because after all it's IAM, or denied. Once access is allowed, other access is completely blocked. Now, without deploying SCPs, the default organization structure of AWS Organizations is full access. So I can set up my AWS organization and then add in my service control policies to control the accounts in my tree. So to create an AWS organization, I first have to open up the AWS organization and add in my master account. Once that is done, I create my organizational units. I'm assuming at this point I have multiple accounts to add in to these organizational units, or it might be the second step, planning for the future. Next, I create my service control policies, which mandate what can and can't be done for the organization, and then I test my policy operation. One other service that is integrated with AWS Organizations is the Resource Access Manager, or RAM. We're going to be looking at RAM in this class, and RAM links with AWS Organizations, allowing you to have even more control of your AWS resources.